Elisabeth of Austria is walking along the Quai du Mont-Blanc in the September sun, moving quickly, as she always does, with a fan held up to shield her face from being seen. She is going to a boat, and she is not going to reach it. This is a story set in Geneva in September 1898, on one of the most beautiful lakeside promenades in Europe, and it concerns a woman who spent most of her adult life trying, with remarkable persistence, to be left alone. The themes here are quiet and human: the weight of grief, the cost of a public life, the strange randomness of a violent act. A man came to Geneva to kill someone else entirely, and when that person didn't appear, he read a newspaper and changed his plans. The weapon he used was barely 4 inches long, and the wound it left was so small that nobody understood what had happened for almost 40 minutes. The investigation that followed was swift and conclusive. The questions it could not answer are still with us. This is the story of the assassination of Empress Elisabeth of Austria, told gently, with care for the historical record, and respect for a woman whose inner life was, in the end, largely her own, and for those who were with her when it ended. Good evening, and welcome. There will be no sudden sounds here, no raised voices, nothing to startle you from rest. If you find comfort in these stories, and wish to follow us, please do. Close your eyes whenever you wish. Let your breathing slow. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Her name was Elisabeth. Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie, Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, born on the 24th of December, 1837 in Munich. She was 60 years old on the day this story reaches its end, and she was, by every account I can find, a woman who had spent most of those 60 years wishing the world would look somewhere else. She carried a fan, in her later years, almost everywhere she went. Not for the heat. She held it up to her face when she was in public, angled to block the direct view of anyone passing close. She had been considered one of the most beautiful women in Europe for most of her adult life, and she had found that fact to be, on balance, more burden than gift. By 1898, she was thin, a little tired, and deeply private, and she managed her privacy the way most people manage a piece of necessary luggage. She simply took it with her everywhere. She was tall, around 172 centimeters, which in that period and among women of her position was notable. She had dark hair and gray eyes, and she walked fast. This is something I keep coming back to, the walking. Everyone who wrote about her in those later years mentions it. She walked at a pace that left her ladies-in-waiting half running behind her, their skirts gathered, their breath short. She didn't slow down. She wasn't being unkind. She simply moved through the world at a speed that matched something in her, some interior urgency, some need to be always going somewhere, even when the destination didn't much matter. She had been an accomplished horsewoman, one of the best in Europe in her prime. She had ridden the way she walked, fast, committed, not much interested in looking graceful. What she wanted was the feeling of it, the speed, the air, the momentary impression that she was answerable to no one, and going somewhere entirely of her own choosing. The riding had been, for a long time, one of the few places she felt like herself. By 1898, her riding days were mostly behind her, but the walking had taken its place. She loved poetry, Heinrich Heine especially. She read him the way some people return to a piece of music, repeatedly, privately, finding different things in it at different times. She wrote poetry herself, filling journals with it over many years, though much of what she wrote she later ordered destroyed, or her family destroyed it for her after she was gone. What survives suggests a mind that was precise, a little melancholy, and thoroughly her own. She had taught herself, ancient Greek in her 50s, not to show anyone, not to put it on display at court, because she wanted to read Homer without someone standing between her and the words. I find this detail the most illuminating thing about her. A woman in her 50s, Empress of Austria-Hungary, sovereign over approximately 50 million people, quietly teaching herself a dead language so she could read an ancient poem the way it was written. She didn't want the intermediary. She never wanted the intermediary. She traveled constantly. Corfu, where she had built herself a house called the Achillean. The Swiss lakes. The French Riviera. Bad Ischl in Austria, where the mountain air agreed with her. Madeira. She was rarely in Vienna, and when she was in Vienna, she was often counting the days until she could leave. The court there was formal, ceremonial, and demanding, and she found it exhausting in a way that had moved, over the decades, from reluctant endurance to something closer to despair. She traveled under an incognito. The title she used was Countess of Hohenems, a real title she held, and it was less a disguise than a preference, a way of traveling without the full ceremony and formality that attended an empress. The hotel staff knew who she was. The local authorities knew. But she wasn't announced. She wasn't presented. She wasn't processed through the usual machinery of a royal visit. She could walk out of a hotel in the morning and be, for a little while, simply a tall woman in dark clothes going somewhere along a lakeside. She protected this as fiercely as she protected anything. On the morning of the 10th of September 1898, she was staying at the Hotel Beau Rivage in Geneva on the Quai du Mont-Blanc. She had been in the city for a short visit, having come from the Villa Rothschild at Pregny, a little way outside Geneva, where she had been staying with her friend Baroness Julie de Rothschild. The plan for that afternoon was straightforward. A short walk along the quay to the steamer landing stage, a boat to Montreux, and from there the continuation of her journey. She had gone out that morning, as she usually did, for a walk. At some point during that walk, she had stopped at a shop and bought chocolate. This, too, is in the record. The chocolate, in her luggage. I don't know what kind. I don't know if it was for herself or for someone else, or whether she simply saw it in the window and wanted it. But it matters to me that she bought it, that the morning had that in it, a small ordinary pleasure on a fine September day. She came back to the hotel. She had lunch. The afternoon lay ahead of her, clear and unhurried, the walk to the boat, the crossing to Montreux, and then wherever she was going next. She was 60 years old, and for a few minutes on that warm lakeside, she was simply going somewhere. Something happened on that walk. I want you to know this gently, before we go any further. Something happened, and by the time it was understood, it was already too late. I'll tell you what it was, and how it came about, and who was there. But first, I want you to know who Elizabeth was, and what her life had been, and why it matters that we're careful with her. Chapter 2. She had been Empress of Austria since she was 16 years old. That's worth sitting with for a moment. 16. The marriage had originally been arranged with her older sister in mind, and then Franz Joseph met Elizabeth and changed his mind, and suddenly she was the one. She had grown up in Bavaria in a family that was royal but relatively informal by the standards of the period, outdoorsy and warm, and then quite abruptly she was empress of one of the most formal courts in Europe, and everyone was looking at her and everyone had opinions about how she was doing it wrong. Franz Joseph loved her. I think this is worth saying clearly, because it can get lost in the more complicated parts of the story. He loved her. His letters to her, in the later years especially, are warm in a way that surprised some of the historians who read them, because the public image of Franz Joseph was of a man as formal and unbending as his own uniforms. He rose before dawn every day. He worked for hours at his desk. He slept on an iron camp bed, even in the imperial palaces, because excess made him uncomfortable. He was 50 years on the throne by 1898, 50 years of duty and discipline and loss, and when he wrote to Elizabeth, his letters were tender. But the marriage was complicated, and it was often distant, and the early years of it were genuinely hard on her. The Viennese court was ruled by Franz Joseph's mother, the Archduchess Sophie, who had decided views about what an empress should be, and who found Elizabeth lacking in most of the relevant categories. Elizabeth's children, in those early years, were largely taken away from her by imperial convention and placed under Sophie's oversight. She found this unbearable. It is one of the things that made her, in those first decades, quietly desperate. She managed it the way she always managed difficult things. She went somewhere else. She found reasons to travel, to be away from court, to be outside in the open air, where the ceremonial machine of the Habsburgs couldn't quite reach her. She rode, she walked, she read. She gradually became, in the language of the court, difficult, which in practice meant that she didn't want to do the things they wanted her to do, didn't want to stand still and be looked at, and perform the role they had written for her. And through all of this, Franz Joseph wrote her warm letters, and she wrote back, and whatever else their marriage was, it was also a genuine connection between two people who had known each other for most of their adult lives. She loved Hungary. This is one of the things the record is clearest about. She championed the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, which reorganized the empire and gave Hungary a more equal standing within it, and the Hungarian people returned her affection with a warmth she found genuinely touching. She learned Hungarian. She spent time there, real time, not ceremonial visits. Hungary felt to her like somewhere she could breathe, and the Hungarians felt that, and they loved her for it. She had 3 children who survived infancy: Gisela, Rudolph, and Marie Valerie. Her relationship with each of them was shaped by the circumstances of their childhood, by how much the court had taken them from her in those early years, by her own complicated grief. The child she was closest to, in her later life, was Marie Valerie, her youngest. Gisela was more distant. Rudolph, her son, her heir, was someone she loved deeply and understood imperfectly, and then he was gone. Rudolph. I need to tell you about Rudolph, because he is part of who Elizabeth was by September 1898, part of the weight she carried along the Quai du Mont-Blanc. On the 30th of January 1889, Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria died at his hunting lodge at Merling. He was 30 years old. He had killed himself, and in the same act had killed a young woman, Mary Vetsura, who had been with him there. The exact circumstances were, and have remained, a subject of considerable historical discussion. But what is not in question is the fact of his death and the manner of it. Elizabeth received the news, and it broke something in her that never fully healed. She wore mourning for the rest of her life, the 9 years between Merling and Geneva, dark clothes, dark colors, the outward mark of a grief she couldn't put down. She told people close to her that she no longer wished to live. She meant it, or at least she meant that the world no longer held what she had come to it for. She kept moving, kept traveling, kept walking fast along lakesides and mountain paths, but something had gone quiet inside her that had once been alive. She was carrying this, still carrying it, in September 1898. 9 years is a long time to grieve, but some losses don't diminish with time. They simply become part of the shape of you, the particular way you hold yourself, the particular quiet that settles around you in unguarded moments. Elizabeth had Rudolph with her everywhere she went. in her mourning clothes, in her poetry, in the way she looked at the world. And she went to Geneva, and she went out in the morning and bought chocolate, and she came back and had lunch, and she made ready for the boat to Montreux. Chapter 3. Let me tell you about Empress Elisabeth, because without her we would know almost nothing about the last hour. Countess Empress Elisabeth was Elizabeth's lady-in-waiting on this journey. She was a Hungarian noblewoman, part of the small, carefully chosen world Elizabeth had built around herself in her later years, the people who were allowed close, who understood what she needed, and gave it without being asked. Her role was companionship and practical management, the arrangements, the luggage, the small negotiations with hotels and steamship companies that attended travel. She was with Elizabeth throughout the day of the 10th of September, through the morning and the lunch and the preparation to leave, and she was there on the quay when it happened, and she was there at the end. 11 years after Elizabeth died, Elisabeth published a memoir. It is called, in German, Aus den letzten Jahren der Kaiserin Elisabeth, which means something like, From the last years of Empress Elisabeth. The grief in it is still legible, even now, even at this distance. She chose her words with care, the way you choose words when you are describing something that still costs you to remember. She is the reason we know what we know about those last minutes, and I want you to hold her account with the respect it deserves. This is a woman writing about the day she watched someone she loved die, writing it so that the record would exist, so that somebody would know. The party traveling that afternoon was small. Elizabeth, Surrey, and a few members of the hotel staff assisting with luggage. No security, no official escort. This was consistent with how Elizabeth always traveled under her incognito. She had been offered, over the years, various degrees of protection, and had declined them. She valued her freedom to move through the world without ceremony, and security detail was ceremony of a particular kind, conspicuous and attended by exactly the kind of attention she was trying to avoid. Whether more should have been done, whether the authorities in Geneva should have arranged additional protection without being asked, is a question that was raised at the time and has been raised since. The answer is genuinely unclear. The broader threat environment was known. The 1890s had seen a sequence of anarchist killings across Europe that had alarmed governments and the public alike. The French president, Sadi Carnot, had been assassinated by an anarchist in 1894. The Spanish Prime Minister, Cánovas del Castillo, in 1897. The pattern was established and documented, and anyone paying attention knew that royalty and heads of state were among the preferred symbolic targets. Whether any specific warning about a threat to Elizabeth had reached anyone in Geneva, I haven't been able to confirm from the sources I have. The broader danger was simply in the air of the period, the way some dangers are, present but unlocated, impossible to guard against everywhere at once. This is where I want to bring in the man who was, at that moment, somewhere in Geneva, making his own preparations. His name was Luigi Luciani, and he was 25 years old, and he had been born in Paris on the 22nd of April, 1873, to an Italian mother who abandoned him shortly after his birth. He had grown up in orphanages in Parma. He had worked as a laborer, as a servant, as a soldier. He had served in the Italian army. He had spent time as a personal servant to a minor Italian nobleman, a Prince Raniero di Vera d'Aragona, whom he had accompanied to various locations. By the time he arrived in Geneva in the weeks before September 1898, he had very little money and a great deal of resentment and a desire, very specific and very strong, to be known. This last thing about him is important. He wasn't, I think, primarily an ideologue. He had absorbed anarchist ideas, spent time in anarchist circles, spoken the language of opposition to monarchy and capitalism, and some of that was genuine. But beneath it was something more personal and more desperate. The wish to matter. To have his name mean something. To be in the newspapers. He had come from nothing, from the very bottom of the European social order, and he was going to make the world notice him. He had come to Geneva to kill the Duke of Orleans, a French royal pretender who had been expected in the city. He had a weapon ready, a needle file, approximately 4 inches long, which he had sharpened to a point. The Duke of Orleans did not arrive. Perhaps his plans had changed. Perhaps the newspaper reports about his expected visit had been wrong. In any case, Luciani found himself in Geneva with a sharpened weapon and no target. And then he read the newspaper. The Empress of Austria was staying at the Hotel Beau Rivage. An empress would do. An empress was, in fact, better. I want to stay with this for a moment, because I think it matters. He redirected because his first choice wasn't available. He chose Elisabeth not out of any personal history with her, not out of any grievance, not because of anything she had done or believed or represented in particular. He chose her because she was there, and she was important, and he wanted to do something important, and she was the most important person he could find at short notice. The randomness of it, the sheer contingency, is one of the hardest things about this story. There's no logic to follow back, no chain of cause and effect that would have let anyone see it coming. He had been watching. He had learned from the newspapers that she was at the Beau Rivage, that she was leaving that afternoon by steamer from the landing stage on the quay. He knew the route she would take. It was a short route, entirely public, along the flat lakeside promenade. And so on the warm afternoon of the 10th of September, he positioned himself on the Quai du Mont-Blanc, and he waited. Elisabeth and Starre finished their lunch. They gathered their things. The luggage was sent ahead. They put on their hats and went out into the September sun, and they began to walk. Chapter 4. The morning had been, by every account, beautiful. September light in Geneva, at that latitude and in that season, has a particular quality. Warm but clear. The shadows starting to lengthen a little, but the air still soft. The lake reflecting the mountains in that flat, steady way it has on calm days. The Quai du Mont-Blanc was occupied by its usual afternoon population. Hotel guests taking the air, local residents, visitors, the ordinary movement of a prosperous lakeside city in the last week of its tourist season. Elisabeth walked fast. Starre was with her, keeping pace, or trying to. The walk from the Beau Rivage to the steamer landing stage was a matter of a few hundred meters, a few minutes at most. The route ran along the waterfront, open on one side to the lake, open on the other to the street and the grand facades of the lakeside hotels. There was nowhere private about it. There was nowhere hidden. She had her fan with her, I assume. She usually did. Whether she was holding it up, I don't know. Perhaps on a warm afternoon, walking toward a boat, she had let it down for a moment. Perhaps the ordinary pleasure of a fine day on a beautiful promenade had given her a moment of ease. Luciani approached from the opposite direction. He was walking toward them along the quay, in his pocket or concealed in his hand, the sharpened needle file. He struck her in the chest as he passed. The motion was swift, barely visible. A man passing a woman on a public walkway, a moment of proximity, and then he was past. He moved away immediately. Elisabeth stumbled. She may have cried out. The accounts vary slightly. Starre caught her, or helped to steady her, or they were both down for a moment on the pavement. Bystanders rushed over. Someone went after the man who had struck her. Elisabeth was helped to her feet. She asked what had happened. She didn't know. That's the thing I keep returning to. In those first moments, she genuinely didn't know. The weapon was so small. The wound it made was so narrow, so precise that it had already closed behind it, the flesh sealing over the point of entry. There was no blood visible. There was no gaping injury to see. What she felt, if she felt anything, might have been a sharp pressure, a blow, something like being struck with a fist. And now she was on her feet again, a little shaken, being steadied by Sterai and perhaps a stranger or two, and the man who had struck her was already running. Luciani ran. He didn't get far. Bystanders pursued him. A porter from a nearby hotel helped to bring him down. Within minutes he was in the hands of the Geneva police. He didn't deny it. He was, by the accounts of those who heard him in those first minutes, almost pleased. Back on the quay, Elisabeth appeared to have recovered. She asked again about what had happened. She was told, perhaps, that a man had struck her, had knocked into her, had acted violently in some way. She seemed, outwardly, to be all right. She could stand. She could walk. And so they continued toward the boat. I think about Stare in these minutes. She is watching Elisabeth carefully, I imagine, the way you watch someone you love after a shock, looking for signs. And Elisabeth seems fine. She seems herself, upright, composed, moving with purpose toward the landing stage. They have a boat to catch. They are going to Montreux. The afternoon is still fine. They reached the landing stage. The steamer was waiting. The luggage had already been sent ahead. They boarded. Elisabeth took a few steps on the deck, and then she went down. She lost consciousness quietly, the way a flame goes out when the air changes. No drama, no warning, just the thing stopping. Stere was there. She caught her, or others on the deck did, and Elisabeth was on the deck of a lake steamer, and she wasn't conscious, and nobody yet understood why. Chapter 5. Shere understood, in the way that people sometimes understand terrible things before they can articulate them, that this was serious. She loosened Elisabeth's clothing. There, on the chest, a tiny mark, barely visible, a small, dark point on the skin, almost nothing, the kind of mark that could have been a bruise from the fall. But it wasn't a bruise. They got her off the boat. A makeshift stretcher was improvised, something from the boat's stores, a sail or an awning. The accounts vary slightly on the material, but agree on the urgency. They carried her back along the quay to the Hotel Beau Rivage, the same route she had just walked, in reverse, and the day was still fine, the light still on the water, the mountains still clear across the lake. Doctors were summoned to the hotel. They came quickly, they examined the wound more carefully, and they understood what it was. The needle file had entered the chest and pierced the pericardium, the sac that surrounds the heart. The weapon was so narrow that the wound had sealed itself almost immediately after the instrument was withdrawn, which was why no blood had been visible, why Elisabeth had been able to stand and walk and board the boat. The blood was on the inside. It had been pooling there, slowly, in the space around her heart, for the 35 or 40 minutes since the attack, and now there was too much of it, and there was nothing to be done. Whether she was in pain, I don't know. The medical testimony from the period suggests the wound itself may not have been immediately agonizing, that the particular nature of the injury meant she might have felt pressure and weakness and confusion more than sharp pain. Whether she understood, in those final minutes of consciousness before she boarded the steamer, that something was gravely wrong, I can't say. Star's account suggests she lost consciousness without recovering it, that there were no final words documented, no moment of understanding before the end. At approximately 10 minutes past 2 in the afternoon of Saturday the 10th of September 1898, Elisabeth died. She was in her room at the Hotel Beau Rivage. She was 60 years old. She was wearing mourning clothes. as she had every day since January 1889. She had chocolate in her luggage from a shop she had visited that morning. I want to stay here, quietly, for just a moment, before we move to what came after. Chapter 6. The news reached Franz Joseph at his summer residence in Bad Ischl, in Austria, later that afternoon. He had been emperor for 50 years. He was 68 years old. He had already received, in those 50 years, more than a man's share of terrible news. The execution of his brother Maximilian in Mexico in 1867. The death of his son Rudolf at Meiringen 9 years before, and now this. His reported words when he was told were, "Nothing is spared me on this earth." I believe him. I believe that is exactly what it felt like, the sense of something inexorable, some impossible accumulation of loss that the years kept adding to, regardless of anything he did or was or believed. He outlived Elizabeth by 18 years. He died in November 1916, still emperor, still working at his desk, still sleeping on his iron camp bed. He never remarried. In the days that followed the assassination, Europe's newspapers ran the story on their front pages. The shock was genuine and widespread. Elizabeth had been a figure of enormous public fascination for decades. Her beauty and her eccentricities and her long absences from court and her personal tragedies, all woven into a story that people had been following at a distance for most of their adult lives. And now she was dead, killed by a man with a sharpened needle file on a public promenade on a fine September afternoon, and nobody could quite make sense of it. The press found Luciani difficult to account for. He was, by every measurable standard, a nobody, a penniless laborer, 25 years old, no significant connections, no personal history with the woman he had killed. His apparent ordinariness was, in some ways, more disturbing than his act. People expected assassins to have motives that matched the magnitude of what they had done. Luciani's stated motive was essentially, "I wanted to kill someone important, and she was available." The press struggled with this. It didn't fit the narrative they were used to. Luciani himself was not struggling. He spoke openly to investigators and to journalists, and what he said was consistent. He was proud. He had done what he had set out to do. He had made his name. He expressed no remorse and showed no sign of any. He had wanted to be known, and now he was known, and that, apparently, was enough. He was tried under Swiss law, which at the time did not include the death penalty. This became a matter of considerable diplomatic friction. Austria was outraged. The newspapers in Vienna and Budapest and across Europe expressed something between frustration and fury that the man who had killed an empress would not be executed. The Swiss authorities pointed out, reasonably, that their law was their law. Luciani was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He spent the following years in prison in Geneva. He wrote a memoir, which survives. Historians who have worked with it describe it as self-aggrandizing and unreliable in parts, the work of a man who continued to be primarily interested in himself and in how he was perceived. But it is his voice, and it tells you something about who he was. It tells you that right up to the end, he understood what he had done primarily in terms of what it had done for him. It had made him famous. The irony of this is the kind that doesn't quite resolve. He got what he wanted, in the narrowest possible sense. His name has been in history books for more than 120 years. But it is there only because of her, only as an appendage to the story of a woman he chose at random from a newspaper. The fame he craved was entirely borrowed, entirely dependent on the person he destroyed. Whether that would have satisfied him, Whether he would have found that a fair trade, I genuinely don't know. He died in his cell on the 19th of October, 1910, apparently by his own hand. He was found hanged. He was 37 years old. The question of why Elizabeth was unprotected was raised at the time and has been discussed since, and I want to handle it carefully because it matters how we frame it. The answer is, mostly, that she chose not to be protected. She had made this choice consistently, over many years, as part of her commitment to a mode of traveling that gave her something close to ordinary freedom. The Swiss authorities in Geneva knew she was in the city. Whether they should have provided security regardless of her wishes, given the documented threat environment of the period, is a question that doesn't have a clean answer. The broader danger was known. No specific warning about a threat to Elizabeth herself has been clearly documented in the sources I have. These are genuine uncertainties, and I think they should stay uncertain rather than be resolved into someone's fault. What I keep returning to is the randomness. Luciani came for someone else. He aimed at an available target rather than a chosen one. He picked up the newspaper and made a practical substitution and went to the Quai. There's no lesson in this, no moral framework that can quite hold it. Some things happen not because of anything that could have been prevented or predicted or understood in advance, but because a particular person was in a particular place at a particular moment, and someone else had decided to use that place in that moment for something terrible. Elizabeth had been, in a sense, trying for most of her life to escape the visible, the ceremonial, the exposed. She had chosen incognito travel and reduced entourages and the freedom of a plain lakeside walk, precisely because she wanted to be unremarkable, unobserved, just a woman going somewhere. And on the afternoon of the 10th of September she had almost managed it. She was, for a few minutes, simply a tall woman in dark clothes moving along the Quai du Mont-Blanc with her face turned toward the water. And it still found her. I've thought a lot about what we can actually know of her inner life, especially in those last years. The journals she kept were largely destroyed, either on her instructions or by her daughter Marie Valérie after the funeral. What survives is partial and filtered. The poetry she chose not to destroy, the letters, the memoir accounts of those who were close to her. She wrote poems that read, at a certain angle, like a sustained preoccupation with death, with release, with the wish to be done. Scholars have noted this carefully, with appropriate caution about the difference between poetic theme and autobiographical confession. I hold it gently, rather than drawing sharp conclusions. What I can say is that the woman walking to the boat on the 10th of September had been carrying grief and exhaustion and a particular kind of world weariness for a long time, and had found her own ways of managing it, and had kept going anyway. She loved her friend Baroness Julie. She loved Hungary. She loved her daughter Marie Valérie. She bought chocolate on an ordinary morning and put it in her luggage for the journey ahead. She had Greek. She had Heine. She had the feeling of walking fast with the lake on one side and the mountains in the distance and the September light on everything, and nobody looking at her, nobody requiring anything, just the open air and the ground under her feet and wherever she was going. She had that. She had it that morning and for the first minutes of the afternoon, and then she didn't. There is something I want to say about the world's relationship with her since her death, because I think it's part of the story too. She has become, in the 120-odd years since Geneva, one of the most mythologized figures of the 19th century. There is a long-running musical called Elisabeth, first performed in Vienna in 1992, that has been seen by tens of millions of people across Europe and Asia. There are films and novels and a museum in the Hofburg in Vienna dedicated to her. The image that most of that material carries is a romantic one. A free spirit trapped by court life, a tragic beauty, a woman ahead of her time who never quite found the freedom she deserved. There's something true in it. But the real Elizabeth was more complicated and more difficult and more melancholy than the romantic version allows. She was sometimes unkind. She was sometimes very hard to reach. Her grief was real, and her intelligence was real, and her frustrations were real, but she wasn't a straightforward heroine, and I think she'd have found the idea of herself as one somewhat irritating. What I want you to carry from this story is not the legend, it's the woman. The one who walked fast and loved her Greek and sat with Heine, and bought chocolate on a fine morning, and held her fan up to her face because she was tired of being looked at. The one who had survived more than most people are asked to survive, and who had found, in her restless movement through the world, something that worked for her, something that felt enough like freedom to be worth continuing for. She was on her way to Montreux. She'd been to Geneva before, and she'd be somewhere else next week, and the week after that somewhere else again. That's who she was in September 1898. Still moving, still going somewhere, still her own person inside the life the world had given her. That matters. I want it to matter, here at the end of this. Chapter 7. There is a plaque on the Hotel Beau Rivage in Geneva. The hotel still stands, still operates, still receives its guests in the same pale stone building on the Quai du Mont-Blanc. The room where Elizabeth died is documented. People go there sometimes, knowing what happened, wanting to be in the place of it. In the Kapuzinerkirche in Vienna, in the imperial crypt beneath the church, Elizabeth is buried. Her tomb is among the most frequently visited in the crypt. People leave flowers there, not officially, not ceremonially. People simply leave them, fresh ones, regularly, because they want to. Because the impulse to mark a life with something living is persistent and human, and doesn't diminish much with time. Irma Chalet lived with what she witnessed for 11 years before she put it into writing. I think about that. 11 years of carrying it before she sat down and found the words. Her memoir is careful and grieving and present tense, in the way that very honest accounts of very hard things often are. She wrote down the chocolate, and she wrote down the wound, and she wrote down the improvised stretcher, because she understood that the record mattered, that the truth of those minutes should exist somewhere in the world. I'm glad she wrote it. I'm glad we have her voice in this story. Franz Joseph received the news and said that nothing was spared him on this earth, and he went back to work because that was what he did, and he kept going for another 18 years, growing older and more solitary, keeping to his iron bed and his early mornings, losing one last time in a larger war, and dying before it ended. He never stopped writing warm letters to people he loved. I believe that, too. And Luciani wanted to be known, and he is known, in the narrow, borrowed way he earned, attached to her name in footnotes in history books, his name always secondary, always in service of hers. He died in a prison cell at 37, and somewhere in that there is a kind of answer to his life's ambition, though not the kind he was imagining. The Quai du Mont-Blanc is still there. It looks, by most accounts, much as it did in September 1898. A wide, flat lakeside promenade, the grand hotels behind it, the lake in front, the Alps visible on clear days across the water, in that way that makes you stop and look every time, no matter how many times you've seen it. The horse-drawn carriages are gone, the fashions are different, but the light is the same light, and the water is the same water, And on a fine afternoon in early autumn, you can stand there and look at the mountains and understand, a little, why someone who loved beauty and open air and the feeling of going somewhere would have walked there quickly and with pleasure. The steamer she was walking toward has long since gone. The particular boat, the particular afternoon, the particular crossing to Montreux that she never made. The water is still there, flat and blue in the September sun, the mountains reflected in it on calm days, the light doing what light does on a lake in autumn, moving and quiet and constant, the way some things are that outlast everything we build around them. She was a woman who taught herself Greek to read Homer. She was a woman who walked fast along lakesides and bought chocolate on fine mornings. She was a woman who had survived marrying in the court and 50 years of being watched, and she had found something in her restless movement through the world that was hers and no one else's, and she was going to Montreux, and she was 60 years old, and the September afternoon was beautiful. Her name was Elisabeth. Thank you for spending this time with her and with me. I hope the telling was worthy of the telling. There is something else I want to say before I let you rest, and it concerns the nature of what we're doing when we tell a story like this one, when we sit down with the record of a person's life and try to make something honest from it. Elisabeth didn't want to be a story. That's one of the things I feel most clearly when I read about her. She destroyed her journals, or arranged for them to be destroyed, because she understood that what she had written there was hers, and she didn't owe it to anyone. She traveled under an assumed title. She held her fan to her face on public promenades. Every instinct she acted on in the latter half of her life was pointed toward the same thing. Don't let them have all of it. Keep something back. Be a person first, and a symbol only when you absolutely must be. She lost that battle comprehensively in the end. The world made a symbol of her almost immediately after her death, and has been adding to it ever since. The musical, the films, the merchandise. The image that most people carry of her is a woman in a white ball gown with dark hair and a tiny waist, looking beautiful and a little wistful, which is not wrong exactly, but is not complete either. It leaves out the Greek. It leaves out the Hein. It leaves out the walking and the driving pace of it and the way her ladies-in-waiting had to half-run to keep up. It leaves out Marilyn, or it puts Marilyn in as backdrop, as atmosphere, rather than as the weight it actually was. I am doing, in telling you this story tonight, something she might not have sanctioned. I want to acknowledge that honestly. I am using the record she left, incomplete as it is by her own design, and I am making something from it and offering it to you. The best I can do, in return for that liberty, is to be careful, to tell you what is known and what is uncertain, to introduce her as a person before I introduce her as a victim, to remember that her privacy mattered to her, and to handle what she did share with the world with the respect that any person's life deserves. I think she would have been, on balance, more at peace with this kind of telling than with the musical. I hope so, anyway. I hold that hope lightly. Let me tell you a little more about the things that lasted, the things that survived the effort to put her away from the world and into the story. Her relationship with Hungary outlasted her in the warmest possible way. The Hungarian people mourned her death with a depth of feeling that was notable, even by the standards of a continent in genuine shock. They had loved her, specifically and not ceremonially, in the way that people love someone who chose them, who learned their language and came to know their country and advocated for their interests, not because it was politically required, but because she genuinely believed in it. She had learned Hungarian in part because of her friendship with Ida Ferenczi, a Hungarian woman who had been one of her closest companions. Through Ida, she had come to understand something of what Hungary was and what it meant to its people, and what she found she loved. The Hungarian parliament held a formal session of mourning. Ordinary Hungarian citizens grieved as for someone they had known personally, which, in a sense, through her attention and her care, they had. Her daughter, Marie Valerie, was 31 years old when her mother died, already married and with children of her own, and she received the news while her mother was still alive, after the telegram had been sent, but before the end. She arrived at Bad Ischl and was with her father when Franz Joseph received the news definitively. Her diary from this period survives, and it is one of the more human documents in the historical record around this event, a daughter's grief, written in real time, in private, not for publication. She wrote about her mother, with love and with honesty, about the difficulty of loving someone who was always, in some fundamental sense, somewhere else. Elisabeth was a complicated mother. She was often absent, often lost in her own grief, often more available in letters than in rooms. And yet the love was there, documented in both directions, and Marie Valerie knew it. She had also loved Ida Ferenczi, with a consistency and warmth that speaks to the kind of friendship Elisabeth was capable of when she allowed it. Ida had served her for decades, had been trusted with things that were not shared with the court, had been part of the small, chosen world that Elisabeth carried with her wherever she went. After Elisabeth died, Ida returned to Hungary and lived quietly, and she kept, for the rest of her life, the private correspondence and the memories that Elisabeth had shared with her, protecting them the way a friend protects things that were given in confidence. This is what I mean when I say the real Elisabeth was more than the legend. The legend has her lonely and misunderstood, adrift in a cold court, beautiful and tragic. The real woman had Ida, and she had Marie Valerie, and she had her friend Julie de Rothschild, whose house at Pregny she had been visiting just before Geneva. She had built, carefully and selectively, a world of people she could trust, and within it, she was not simply a symbol or a sorrow. She was a friend, a mother, a companion. She was difficult, yes, and sometimes absent, and sometimes lost in something she couldn't share. But she was also, in the spaces she protected from ceremony, genuinely herself, and the people who knew her in those spaces remembered her with something warmer than awe. The CC Museum in the Hofburg in Vienna, which opened in 2004, has received millions of visitors. It presents Elisabeth with care and with genuine historical effort, and it is better than many of the more popular portrayals. But even there, even with the best intentions, the display inevitably tends toward the beautiful objects, the dresses, the riding portraits, the famous photographs, the waist. Always the waist, as if the most significant thing about her were a measurement. The objects are beautiful, and they're part of the historical record, but they are the outward Elisabeth, the one she offered to the world when she had no choice, and they are not the same as the one who sat in her room at night and read Heine and wrote in journals she intended to destroy. I want to return one more time to Story, because I think she deserves a little more than I've given her tonight. She was 37 years old when Elisabeth died. She had been in service as a lady-in-waiting for several years by that point, part of the small world that traveled with Elisabeth, and she had come to know her in the particular intimate way that comes from proximity and shared movement, from the long, quiet days of travel, and the mornings at new hotels and the conversations at meals in foreign cities. When she wrote her memoir 11 years later, she was 48, and she had spent more than a decade thinking about what to say and how to say it. The memoir is written with restraint. This is worth noting, because restraint is a choice, and in this case it feels like a deliberate act of respect. She doesn't reach for drama. She doesn't impose retrospective significance on moments that at the time seemed ordinary. She describes the morning in Geneva, the preparations, the walk, the moment of the blow, Elisabeth's question, the decision to continue to the boat, the loss of consciousness on deck, all of it in a tone that is precise and measured and full of a grief she doesn't name directly, but that is present in every careful sentence. She is protecting Elisabeth's dignity in the act of telling what happened. She understood that the truth could be told without being made into spectacle. What the memoir also contains, between the facts, is evidence of how much she loved her, not in a sentimental declaration, but in the attention. The details she chose to include, the things she remembered, the way she writes about Elisabeth's voice, her movements, the particular quality of her presence. Stadteret was a witness, yes, and her account is invaluable for that reason. But she was also a person who had lost someone she cared for, and she wrote from inside that loss, with the full weight of it, and the weight shows. I'm glad she wrote it. I've said that already, but I want to say it again. She did the thing that grief sometimes asks of us, which is to turn toward the loss rather than away from it, to make the record, to ensure that the truth of those minutes exists somewhere in the world for people to find. She couldn't have known, sitting down to write in 1909, that more than 100 years later someone would be reading her words and telling them to a listener in the dark. But that's what has happened, and her care is present in every word of it. The investigation in Geneva moved quickly and concluded cleanly. Luciani had been caught within minutes of the attack. He had made no attempt to flee far, or to disguise what he had done. The Swiss investigators established, without meaningful doubt, that he had acted alone, that there was no broader conspiracy, no network that had planned or directed the killing. He had made his plan himself from a newspaper in a few days. He had a sharpened file. He had a grudge against the world that was fundamentally personal, dressed in ideological clothing. He had done what he had done, and he was caught, and that was that. The anarchist movement of the 1890s was real, and it was serious, and it carried genuine political convictions. There were people within it who had thought deeply about the systems they opposed, and who argued, however wrongly, from a coherent set of beliefs about the injustice of concentrated power and the necessity of violent opposition to it. Luciani, the historians tend to agree, was not really among them. He had the language, he had the associations. But the core of what drove him was personal ambition of a peculiar kind, the desire to matter, to be seen, to be known. He had come from nothing, and he wanted to leave something. It was a more ordinary human impulse than the ideological frame he put around it, and in some ways, that ordinariness makes it harder to hold, not easier. The Swiss authorities handled the legal proceedings with the rigor their system required, and the outcome, life imprisonment, satisfied no one outside Switzerland and most people within it. Elisabeth's death had been mourned across Europe with genuine and widespread feeling, and there was considerable public appetite for a sentence that matched that feeling. Life imprisonment did not match it, but Swiss law was Swiss law, and the canton of Geneva had jurisdiction, and there was nothing Austria or anyone else could formally do about it. Franz Joseph's government protested through diplomatic channels. Austrian newspapers expressed outrage. The Swiss authorities expressed regret and stood firm. And Luciani went to prison, where he spent the next 12 years writing his self-serving memoir and receiving the attention he had always craved, the prison visitors and the journalists, and the occasional correspondent who found him interesting. He managed, within the constraints of a cell, to be something he had always wanted to be, a subject of public curiosity. Whether the cell itself seemed a reasonable price for that, Whether he thought about it in those terms, his memoir doesn't clearly resolve. He hanged himself in 1910 with a belt in his cell. He had been in prison for 12 years. He was 37. The Geneva prison recorded it as suicide. Some accounts note that he had been in poor spirits in the period before his death, but the memoir doesn't give us a reliable inner life to read. He wanted to be known, and in some narrow sense he succeeded, and then he was gone, and what remained of him in the historical record was almost entirely shaped by someone else's story. There is a detail I haven't mentioned yet that I want to give you now, because I think it belongs in the account. When Elisabeth's body was returned to Vienna for the state funeral, the city that had often felt to her like a kind of captivity received her with the full weight of imperial mourning. The ceremonial machine that she had spent so much of her life circumventing was engaged one last time, and she moved through it now as she couldn't have done in life, without resistance, without the fan and the incognito and the urgent walking. The Viennese came out in very large numbers. They lined the streets. They stood in silence. Many of them were weeping. She had not been, in life, particularly beloved in Vienna. Her absences were noted and sometimes criticized. The court had its own complicated feelings about her, the way courts have always had complicated feelings about people who don't want to be there. But in death, something shifted. The city claimed her, and the people mourned, and it was genuine, not just ceremonial. They were mourning, I think, several things at once. The woman they had known imperfectly, the beauty and the tragedy, the cumulative losses of a family that seemed to attract catastrophe, and something else, some quality she had represented to them without quite meaning to. Some quality of wildness and freedom and refusal that they had found compelling, even when it frustrated them. She was buried in the Kapuziner Gruft, the imperial crypt, in the heart of Vienna, the city she had always been trying to leave. There's something in that placement that she probably would have felt, some irony or some resignation. After everything, she came back. The city she spent 60 years finding reasons to be away from is where she is. And people leave flowers. I think of the flowers sometimes, when I think about what a life means after it's over. Fresh flowers, left by people who feel moved to leave them, who come to the crypt and find her tomb, and want to mark being there with something living. It's not a small thing. It's the opposite of a small thing. It means that more than 120 years after she died, something about her life still calls out to the living in a way that asks for acknowledgement. Whatever the legend has made of her, whatever the musical and the films and the tourist industry have done, something real is getting through. The Quai du Mont-Blanc catches the light in early September the way she would have seen it that last afternoon. Flat and golden, the lake beyond it, almost still, the mountains across the water in that state of perfect clarity that comes when the air has just the right quality. The promenade is open. Guests from the hotels walk along it. Tourists pause to look at the water and the mountains and take photographs. Life moves along it in its ordinary way, which is exactly the quality she loved about it, the ordinariness, the openness, the fact that she could be nobody there for a few minutes. She walked that promenade more than once in her visits to Geneva and the Swiss lakes over the years. She walked it quickly, ahead of whoever was with her, the lake on her left and the mountains clear and distant, and the September air on her face. She was 60 years old, and she had Greek, and she had chocolate from the morning, and she was going to Montreux, and the water was blue, and the mountains were bright, and for those last few minutes, entirely without drama, she was simply herself. That's what I want to leave you with. Not the wound, not the confusion on the quai, not the makeshift stretcher, or the hotel room, or the telegram to Bad Ischl. Those are part of the story, and I've told them because the truth deserves to be complete. But they are not where Elizabeth lives in the account she left us. She lives in the Greek she taught herself at 50-something, sitting down each day with a text and a grammar, and the patient conviction that she had the right to understand Homer's actual words. She lives in the Heine she returned to again and again, finding in his particular melancholy something that matched her own without diminishing it. She lives in the journals she filled and then arranged to have burned, the private record of a private mind, protected to the last. She lives in the warmth she showed to people she chose, to Ida, and to Julie, and to Marie Valerie, and to the country of Hungary, which she gave her actual attention, and not just her ceremonial presence. She was a complicated woman, as most people are when you look at them clearly. She was sometimes difficult, and sometimes absent, and sometimes lost in a grief she couldn't fully share. She was also brilliant and kind in her particular way, and funny sometimes, and tenacious in the things she cared about, and capable of a loyalty that the people she offered it to carried for the rest of their lives. Her name was Elisabeth. She lived for 60 years. She walked fast, and she loved Greek, and on the morning of the 10th of September, 1898, she bought chocolate from a shop in Geneva and put it in her luggage for a journey she never finished. Sudroy wrote it all down so that we would know. Franz Joseph said that nothing was spared him on this earth, and he went on, because going on was what he did, and he kept her letters. The lake is still there. The light on it, on a clear September afternoon, looks much as it did then. Thank you for being here with me tonight. I hope you found something worth resting with in her story, and I hope the telling honored her. Rest well. A peaceful night to you.